Hey everybody, I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, January 7th, 2024. Today, I want to think with you about continental philosophy. What is it? Why does it matter? And how might it maybe help us be a better mountain biker? All right, see you in a minute. If you have not yet connected with me over at Substack at Philosophy in the Wild, please do. There is content weekly over there, both for free and paid subscriptions, so please check out Philosophy in the Wild. All right, so today I want to think about continental philosophy. And I want to do this because a very good friend of mine, somebody who I consider one of the very best young Kierkegaardian scholars in the game, Amber Bowen, reached out and said she's teaching a class on continental philosophy, and it would be so cool to have a video that kind of introduces some of the big basic ideas of continental philosophy, but in a way that was accessible to non-experts. In her case, these students just beginning to study the topic. So that's what I thought I'd do today. If you've taken a philosophy course in, the last 40 or 50 years, you've probably heard mention of a distinction between continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. What is that distinction? Well, I can't go into too much detail because whole books are written on it. But in brief, I want to give three maybe ways of differentiating the two, not in absolute terms, but as general guidelines for maybe making sense of some of the differences. First, continental philosophy understands the poet as perhaps a better model for inquiry than the scientist. Analytic philosophy, alternatively, tends to side with the scientist as this kind of exemplar for how we think about ourselves and the world. Second, continental philosophy focuses on the mode in which our lived experience is anchored in embodiment, whereas analytic philosophy often and historically has focused on the use of language as the logical mode for achieving precision in our arguments. And finally, continental philosophy thinks that there's probably a pretty good reason to read Hegel. And analytic philosophy often tends to think that philosophy in a historical sense stopped rightly after Kant's first critique. Now, I want to make clear, all of these are kind of tongue-in-cheek. None of them are meant to be absolute hard and fast distinctions. But continental philosophy does, I think, offer some really important modes for how to make sense of ourselves, others, the world, and even envision future possibilities. Let me offer just a few examples of the ways in which continental philosophy does that. By leaning into this idea of the poet as an example, continental philosophy understands that hermeneutics, or interpretation, is something that goes all the way down. What it looks like to understand our existential condition is as limited and fallible. We are humbled by the very fact of being inquirers. We don't have everything figured out. So we've got to do the best we can to make sense of where we start to ask questions. This hermeneutic turn that continental philosophy embraces opens onto what is sometimes referred to as a hermeneutics of suspicion. And the idea is that we take seriously the structural frameworks by which we tend to already begin with assumptions, with biases. We don't start from neutral. We don't start from a God's eye view and then begin to add in to our knowledge base. We start already existing. As Jean-Paul Sartre says, we have embarked. It's like trying to make sense of where you're going by waking up halfway into the journey. And this is where I think our embodiment really plays out so importantly. Existence itself is the very condition of thinking. It's not something to somehow argue our way out of, but it's something to lean deeply into. Human existence, in light of this hermeneutics of suspicion, is something that invites a kind of distrust to our immediate and normal intuitions about the way things work. There are probably structures of power, of interest, of money that do kind of lean us in directions that then become so subtle that we take them for granted without interrogating them. So this distrust is not suggesting that continental philosophy is a distrusting discourse. It's to actually invite us to take seriously when trust is appropriate. And yet, it's always risky. So because we start with this interpretive frame, anchored in our embodied existence, in light of the structures of power by which we find ourselves asking questions to begin with, this actually helps us then make sense of what it would look like to carry forth certain hopes into the world. What kind of world are we trying to make real? Not simply, how do we make sense of the real world? That idea that the world is a possibility, that the world is a space waiting for our input, is something that continental philosophy, I think, offers in an existential way that is invigorating. Now, how might this all connect to being a mountain biker? Well, follow me on this. I love mountain biking. I like less road biking. I'm just not a roadie. Now, the point, though, is mountain biking and road biking are both biking. You are being propelled forward by your own energy on a two-wheeled mechanism. The difference, however, is important. Mountain biking requires a sort of awareness by which you make sense of where you are at all times, because you're actively deciding, is this the right line through this trail? Should I go over that rock or around it? What's the best way to unweight or press heavy into those roots? It's an interpretive action from the outset.
Sheet right. There we go. Nice. Nice. Nice job.
Alternatively, road biking certainly requires interpretation. Which is the best route to take? How should I navigate the incline? What gear is the best way to do it? But all of those moves are in the context of a fairly stable surface. You're riding on pavement. And that assumption about the way things are behind the scenes is what continental philosophy sometimes wants to then throw question marks in response to, right? That's where the distrust begins to happen. It's not suggesting that there's not a way through this, but it is inviting us to take seriously the task of embracing that risk. Now, analytic philosophy, road biking, is also a risky activity. I am way less scared of rocks and trees than I am of teenagers with cell phones. I don't like road biking because it scares me. But both require understanding risks in different ways. Road biking facilitates conversation. Mountain biking is more inhabited with giggling and oh crap moment as you try to dodge certain obstacles. So it's not to suggest that continental philosophy and analytic philosophy are absolutely at odds. It's to suggest that like mountain biking and road biking, they are different modes of doing the same thing. Philosophy is what matters. Getting on the bike is the point. But how we do that can look very different in different contexts. And for me, I find the particular mode of risk, the way in which we interpret, and then the propulsion forward into a possibility that is often unseen fully, that mountain biking offers, to be a little bit more compelling than road biking, with the idea that you have your 50-mile route scheduled in advance. So both are awesome. Do philosophy, whatever form. Get on your bike and go on whatever trail, whatever road is in front of you. But
nice.
But don't miss the idea that continental philosophy, like mountain biking, might offer some distinctives that are worth trying if all you know is riding in spandex. Alternatively, like myself, if you tend to think that mountain biking is really the only option, then putting on some tights, getting your Gore-Tex jacket, and flying down a hill at 35 miles an hour in conversation with friends on a 50-mile ride is well worth your time as well. Perhaps a good way to sum this up is in the words of my friend Waylon, who says, if you don't road bike, your fitness will be pretty poor. But if you don't mountain bike, you probably won't have any soul. I think maybe that's something similar to Continental and analytic thinking. Analytic philosophy will get us very fit. It sharpens our argumentative tool set. But it's also the case that unless we have that existential grit underneath that rigor, then we might be applying arguments to things that may not have much traction in our lives. So I hope that's helpful. It's clearly not meant to be some sort of absolute divide. I think everything in philosophy is worth taking seriously and digging deep into it, just like anything on two wheels. So have a wonderful rest of the day. I'll see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.